Brain trauma. It's happened to all of us at one point or another. A fall in the playground, an attempt at touching a kangaroo, but have you ever been discombobulated?
Discombobulate. Dazed. Discombobulate. Distract target. Discombobulate.
Distinguished dignitaries of the linguistic discipline, I have quite the dissertation to display on this fine day. Recently, Eternal and I, disproportionately dedicated researchers in the disturbing, have discovered something that will disrupt the very world of linguistics and our very understanding of neuroscience forever. For what we have disinterred from the depths of despair is the dismaying reality that those who are concussed are not simply dazed. What if I told you that, in the state of bedazzlement resulting from a hard knock to the cranium, the victim is not simply off-kilter, but rather has entered a community of pure eloquence and become a fluent speaker of one of the most intricate languages ever to be spoken on this earth? What if I told you that a concussion is not a temporary impediment, but rather a window, a gateway to a form of understanding that we mere mortals would long to experience for a single moment? Tell me, have you ever truly been discombobulated? Well, let's find out. I asked members of the Agma Schwa Discord server, our research community, to tell me how they thought this should be pronounced.
Rare is the original
And well, I found my answer. None of you are currently discombobulated. If you were, you would have boldly and correctly proclaimed that this is an ungrammatical sentence, as it's missing the rests. Believe me, if you don't understand, you will soon. What does this mean? Well, if you weren't faking it, you'd know. But now that I've confirmed that you're all just posers, I may as well just tell you. It roughly translates to break cracked ribs, traumatize solar plexus, dislocate jaw entirely, heel kick to the diaphragm. Now this isn't your fault. I forgive you, okay? I forgive you. Most people are only discombobulated for a few hours, maybe a few weeks at most. After providing hundreds of test subjects with thousands of concussions over the past 5 years, we finally have enough data to provide a comprehensive grammar. Allow us to disabuse you of your misconceptions of this beautiful language. Maybe next time you are thoroughly concussed, instead of hoping for recovery, you'll cherish the poetry of the discombobulated experience. Discombobulate is primarily a language of psychological warfare. It can be spoken by someone in a cogent state in order to cause distress in a victim, and it can be understood only by someone who has been thoroughly discombobulated. Learning this language requires someone to have experienced at least one major concussion. Assuming you fulfilled the prerequisite, as I most certainly have, you have the capacity to get started. So, let us begin. Phonology. As ever, let us first discuss the phonology of discombobulate. Discombobulate has, actually, discerning the exact number of phonemes is a bit complicated, shall we say. You'll see what I mean, but regardless, its consonants are
na, nya, nga, ta, ta, ka, ba, za, sha, ha, za, ja, ja, ra, ra, la,
That's right, no velar or labial sounds, but instead a bunch of uvulars. Next, its vowels are
I, U, E, O, A,
There you go. Pretty normal, right? Wrong. See, while this is by no means an incorrect or dissatisfactory analysis of the discombobulate phoneme distribution, there is another layer to this, if you will. You may have noticed that vowels displayed here are labeled as coronal and so on, rather than as front, central, back. This is because discombobulate has a very distinct system of both vowel and consonant harmony. Specifically, all consonants in a word must have the same place of articulation, and all vowels must have the same frontness. Moreover, the vowel frontness and consonant place of articulation must be the same as well. That is, a coronal word can only have front vowels, which it then makes sense to describe as the coronal vowels, and so on. Specifically, the place of articulation of the word, right, let that sink in for a moment, the word, is determined entirely by the first consonant or vowel in the word. For example, if a word starts with the S phoneme, sa, it cannot contain sh or h. Effectively, the sounds sa, sh, and h are indistinguishable in any position rather than at the very start of the word. But wait, doesn't this mean that they're in complementary distribution and hence the same phoneme? Well, no, not really, because they are still distinct in word initial positions. So while they aren't the same phoneme, there actually is another term that we can use to describe this phenomenon, and it's one that an avid watcher of my channel,
Subscribe if you haven't already, by the way.
if you are one of those avid subscribers, I'm sure you will already be well familiar with this concept, that being archiphonemes. That's right, in non-word initial position, discombobulate actually has 8 consonant archiphonemes and only 3 vowel archiphonemes. There are also particles that consist entirely of archiphonemes, but more on that later. That's still not all. Owing to the fact that speaking discombobulate with a distinguished degree of fluency requires one to have suffered at least one major concussion, frequent pauses in speech evolved rather naturally as the damaged brains of its speakers struggled to form coherent sentences. In modern day discombobulate, this has led to the formation of 3 phonemic rests. That's right, silence is now phonemic. In writing, these are usually indicated with musical notation, but since that's rather hard to typeset, you can alternatively use 1 to 3 dots instead. But this is rather disapproved of in proper writing. Finally, the phonotactic structure of discombobulate is, well, this abomination, where the lowercase letters are the archiphonemes they denote, and the uppercase letters represent the classes shown on screen here. Note that the phonotactics here does not include rests, which are allowed anywhere in a word, but they never occur in lemmas and instead arise only as the result of various grammatical processes such as inflection. But more on that later. Orthography. Harmony also has a profound impact on discombobulate's peculiar orthography. Now, since this has all been rather abstract so far, let's take a look at some words, just to illustrate the inner workings of this system. For example, the name John Watson is commonly loaned into discombobulate as Dazan Rakong. As you can see, all the sounds in Dazan are coronal, and all the sounds in Rakong are uvular. However, the especially discerning among you may have noticed something strange about the spelling of these words. For example, the a archiphoneme in Rakong is spelt without the ring above it, even though it is a uvular a and not a. If you were to take a look at the vowel chart from earlier, you'd probably expect Watson to be spelt like this. However, this would lead to some words turning into a rather abysmal soup of diacritics, which we'd rather avoid. Anyone would. It turns out that discombobulate's harmony provides a very straightforward way of doing so. Specifically, this leads us to the concept of the determining consonant or vowel. The first sound in a word determines the place of articulation for the rest of the word. For example, the da in dazan is coronal, hence the rest of the word is too. And the r with a caron in rakong is uvular. And so is the rest of the word. Because of the harmony, we don't need to explicitly restate this fact for every sound in the word. The rule then is this: diacritics are only used in the first letter in a word. Thus, in the case of rakong, the G with the caron already tells us that this word is uvular, so we can omit the ring on the A, and so on. Now, there is only one last part to this. Some consonants can occur in several places of articulation. This is what the light gray sounds in parentheses indicate on the table. For instance, t and da are coronal by default, but they can also occur in palatal words. Phonetically, they would be palatalized, of course, but they'd be part of the same phoneme. Similarly, the glottal stop can appear in every word, but by default, it's uvular. Keep in mind that uvular here refers to uvular harmony. It's still a glottal stop. Of course, the glottal stop is always pronounced as glottal and is never actually uvular. As the determining consonant, however, both t and duh force the entire word to be coronal, and the glottal stop forces the word to be uvular, and so on. This is what we mean when we say that these sounds have a default place of articulation. As an example, shaja is a legal discombobulate word, but jasha isn't, as the duh in an initial position would force the rest of the word to be coronal, meaning it would turn into dasa. Also, now that we're done discussing the orthography, there's one last thing to note, and this is the fact that discombobulate doesn't actually use spaces or capital letters. These last couple of slides had them only to ease the explanation of the harmony patterns, but now that that's over, we'll be switching to the proper orthography for the rest of the video. As an example, that means that John Watson will be spelt like this from now on. Training wheels are coming off. Get used to it. It's only gonna get worse. Nouns. Now, enough about phonology for now. Let's talk about the nouns. Discombobulate nouns have at least 2 syllables. Should the base form of a noun consist of a single syllable, the particle set is placed after the noun. Note that this particle consists entirely of archiphonemes. Its pronunciation depends on the determining sound of the noun it follows. For example, in nguhmail, table, but nghok, person. Doesn't this mean, though, that the noun is actually just 2 syllables and that this so-called particle is actually just part of the noun? No, because it is dropped in compounds as well as in certain grammatical constructions, but we'll talk more about the details of what happens there later. Discombobulate nouns inflect for number, singular, pockle, and plural, as well as for state. The state can either be absolute or construct. The absolute state is the default, and the construct state is used for possession and in some other miscellaneous constructions. If you don't know about the construct state, it exists in Arabic and various other Semitic languages. The most important feature of a discombobulate is its persistent use of a very special kind of affix, though. You're probably already familiar with prefixes and suffixes, which attach to either end of a word, with infixes, which are inserted into words, and maybe even with circumfixes, which surround words. Collectively, these are called the affixes. But today we need to talk about a different kind of affix, one from which the language gets its name. For, you see, discombobulate exclusively uses the disfix. A disfix entails the removal of sounds from a word rather than attaching something to it. For instance, take the word nguhmail. In order to form, for example, the absolute plural of tables, the second vowel of the word is deleted, while this would give or something like that. This is not a valid word, as it would contain an illegal consonant cluster, and thus an entire series of consonant resolution rules kicks in to bring this word into a pronounceable form. What clusters count as illegal is shown in the phonotactics. In this particular case, we have a non-initial 3-consonant cluster, which means that the middle consonant is resolved. In this case, the S archiphoneme is transformed into an E archiphoneme, leaving us with nguhmail. Now, how about we try forming the construct singular? This form is actually based on the absolute plural and is formed by deleting the second vowel, leaving us with what? No. That also contains an illegal cluster. If we attempt to resolve this by the same principle, we run into the issue that the R archiphoneme also becomes the E archiphoneme, which would yield niet. But this process also requires us to break hiatus by inserting an R archiphoneme, which leaves us with nguhmail again, which is exactly what we started with. In some dialects of discombobulate, this is fine, but others go the extra mile and require that if resolution of a consonant results in the same word we started with, then that consonant is deleted instead, leaving us with ŋimp as the final result. Cluster a resolution. Alright, now that we've looked at some examples, let us introduce the cluster resolution process in all of its glory. This is not just used for nouns, but really for anything that makes use of disfixes, which in Dis-combobulate is everything, so it's worth analyzing in detail. First, given some illegal cluster, we select a single consonant to resolve as follows. In a word initial cluster, most dialects resolve the first consonant, though others simply apply rules 2 to 4 below. In 4 consonant clusters, resolve the first 3 as a consonant cluster instead. In 3 consonant clusters, resolve the middle one. In 2 consonant clusters, resolve the first one. These steps are repeated until we've selected a single consonant to resolve. Then this consonant is resolved according to the following consonant resolution rules. First, the consonant is converted to a vowel according to the rules shown here. Normally, these rules operate on archiphonemes, but there are exceptions with la, ha, and la, all of which turn into the I archiphoneme. If any illegal clusters remain, perform cluster resolution again. Some dialects instead simply drop the consonant being resolved if resolution doesn't fix the word, and only then repeat cluster resolution if that still leaves us with an illegal word. But finally, any instances of vowel hiatus this may have resulted in are resolved by inserting the R archiphoneme between any 2 vowels in hiatus, though not across what used to be the word boundaries in compounds. Additionally, some dialects also consider resolution to have failed if this yields the exact same words that were there before. The deletion of some sound kick-started in the entire resolution process to begin with. In this case, the last consonant that was resolved successfully is instead dropped, and we start over from there. Note that all of these inserted sounds are archiphonemes. Unless they are inserted at the very start of a word, they assume the place of articulation of the rest of the word. For example, if the word is uvular, converting the first consonant to the archiphoneme E will yield O. However, there are cases where a word's place of articulation may change. For example, the verb zhichirung is palatal, but in the perfective, this turns into jiren, meaning the entire word is now coronal because the phoneme ta is now the new determining consonant, and that is coronal, and thus the word is coronal. Does that make sense? No? Okay, moving on. Now that we've discussed cluster resolution, we can finally take a look at the full noun paradigm. For nouns, the disfixes always entail the deletion of vowels. So for instance, V1 in this table means that the first vowel in the word is dropped, which then usually creates a consonant cluster that needs to be resolved. As we briefly mentioned earlier, some forms require multiple disfixes. For instance, forming the construct plurals entails the deletion of the first and second vowel, and only then is cluster resolution performed, if applicable. However, the construct singular is formed by taking the absolute plural after the cluster resolution and then deleting the second vowel, followed by another round of cluster resolution if need be. Easy. Verbs. Alright, let's talk about verbs. We're gonna talk about verbs, okay? Look at me, we're talking about verbs. Hey you, the non-subscriber, subscribe, and then listen to me talk about verbs. Verbs follow the same cluster resolution patterns, but their conjugation rules make them easy to distinguish from nouns. You'll be happy to learn that they don't conjugate for person or number. And you'll be very disappointed to learn that they do conjugate for aspect, mood, and valency. The tables on the screen show the disfixing procedures required to properly conjugate a verb. There's a very important reason that these are shown on 3 distinct tables rather than one disconcertingly large one. And it's because the order of operations is absolutely vital to achieve the correct result. What do I mean by that? Well, to properly conjugate a verb, one must first conjugate according to the desired aspect pattern. There's a high chance that this will yield an illegal sound cluster which must be resolved immediately. Then, once the aspect has been resolved, one can move on to the mood pattern. Once the mood is selected, the disfixation occurs and any illegal clusters must be resolved again. And finally, the valency of the clause must be selected, conjugated for, and the illegal consonant clusters must be removed a 3rd time. This is key to the meaning of the sentence, so be sure not to make a mistake. That is, if you're attempting to speak Dis-combobulate with a still undazed mind, for in a properly concussed state, this would all come completely naturally to you. For example, let's conjugate the verb hohagong, to throw. in the transitive habitual irrealis. First, we conjugate for aspect. The habitual aspect deletes the first consonant, which leaves us with ohagon. Next, for the irrealis mood, we delete the second vowel and replace the second consonant with a rest, which results in oh, ong. Lastly, to use transitive valency, we delete the last consonant, leaving us with oh, oh. Look at you, you're on your way to the concussion B1 exam already. Word order! You may have noticed that there was no discussion of tense. There's no conjugation for tense encoded into the verb disfixes, only aspect, mood, and valency. That's because there are two tenses in discombobulate, present and non-present. This information is encoded exclusively into the word order of a clause. That's right, word order is extremely strict in discombobulate. Like seriously, you have no idea how strict the word order gets? You'll see. The word order for a clause in the present tense is SOV, while in the non-present tense, the word order is VSO. In ditransitive clauses, present is SOVI, I being indirect object, and in the non-present, it is IVSO. You must be wondering, how is non-present practical? Well, only something happening right now can be proven to be happening, right? And when you're in a state of discombobulation, you perceive time so slowly that the further away you get from the actions and conditions of the immediate present, the more it seems like a distant dream. So, of course, this is the most practical way to communicate. There is an auxiliary verb that essentially equates to will, that being telent. But this is only used when being particularly polite. The famed detective Sherlock Holmes is known for keeping himself perennially discombobulated in order to improve his case-solving skills. He famously speaks politely even during the most distressing situations, even though he is well aware that his sparring partners and soon-to-be thwarted criminals will likely have no memory of the exchange in the long term. Adjectives. Adjectives are a bit more simple. A typical adjective immediately precedes its noun and requires no agreement with the noun's number or state. There's a couple different forms of adjective, though. The simple adjective is interpreted as a distinct word from the noun, albeit contained in the same overarching noun phrase. There is also the adjective noun, one of the three types of compound nouns that exist in discombobulate. In this situation, the word boundary is removed, and thus the place of articulation of the adjective overwhelms the place of articulation for the noun. Adjective nouns usually have a slightly different definition, or at least sense, than a noun phrase which simply includes an adjective in a noun. For example, take, transparent window. This is a simple adjective and noun. This is slightly different from pronounced exactly the same, but it's more of a single word, like the clear window. This could mean something like a window that is specifically not a one-way window, or a window that looks impossibly clear without any blemishes, but it's definitely a different word on a sentence tree. In this case, there's no difference in pronunciation whatsoever, since both constituent words are already coronal. The other two types of compound nouns are the noun-noun compounds, which can feature the epenthesized duplicate of the first vowel of the first word, if the combination would otherwise create an illegal cluster, and the disjunct phrase is the third type, but we'll get into the disjunct phrase later. The only other important thing to know about adjectives is that there is a procedure for converting a noun into an adjective, called the adjectivization procedure. Many adjectives exist independently of nouns, but most of them end with the L archiphoneme, and the pattern for adjectivization converts the final archiphoneme of a noun's singular absolute form into the L archiphoneme, except for roots which end in the R archiphoneme, which can remain R. In the case of L or R final noun forms, the final vowel is removed and the cluster resolution procedure is enabled. For example, if we take the word for blood, that goes through a few steps and results in bloody, which is ararir, and ralal, window, goes through a couple steps and comes out as raril, which is transparent. Simple, not too distressing, right? Adverbs. Adverbs are also, perhaps dissatisfyingly, quite simple. If it's an adverb modifying an adjective, it precedes the adjective, as seen in the phrase, "Angu sal alejle," which is totally dry steak. If it modifies a verb, it depends on the tense of the clause. In a present, thus SOV clause, the adverb immediately follows the verb. For example, "Holusha o satini," which means Holmes quickly punches him. As an aside, the third person pronoun sh is an exception to the rule that only the first sound in a word can receive a diacritic. Just a little quirk there for the spelling system. Helps distinguish it from the first person pronoun, which is se. In a non-present, and thus VSO clause, the adverb immediately precedes the verb. For example, satini o holosho, which means Holmes quickly punched him, or Holmes will quickly punch him. If a clause contains an auxiliary verb with a verb, the adverb can precede or follow whichever specific verb the adverb would best fit with for the speaker's desired meaning to be achieved. That's pretty much it. Be thankful for that one. Numbers. The way the dilettantes of concussion and distilled artists such as Sherlock Holmes alike count their numbers is, to say the least, quite distant from the methods of the average English speaker. For us in our sober states, it's easy to see that the most unmarked form of our numbers are their cardinal forms. 1 clue, 2 heel kicks, 10 weeks in the hospital. This may seem intuitive to us, but the unmarked form for numbers to the discombobulated is actually their adverbial forms. Ja, once. Zin, twice. Thrice. You get the point. Those are the simplest forms for numbers, and they are adverbs. For example, zin, set, which means I ran twice. The simplest adjectival form for numbers is actually their ordinal forms, which are slightly irregular, but mostly look like the adverbial numbers, with their first archiphoneme replaced with the ta archiphoneme. For example, tar, first, 10, second, ti, third, naseger, etini tiser, which means this is the fourth dog. And finally, the cardinal form. This is created by taking the adverbial form and pairing it with the cardinal particle, del. This counts as 2 words, which explains the illegal clusters and lack of harmony here. Radel, 1. Zindel, 2. Del, 3. Senatata del onkong ere. I want 9 concussions. This style of counting assists in communicative efficiency during combat, of course. Kick once, slap thrice, etc. You'll understand soon enough. Lastly, if you were wondering, all numbers are base 10, sub base 5. Why? Because you need a fully intact fist to truly discombobulate. Dispositions. Well, with that, we have concluded the easy part. I'm really sorry about what comes next. It's time to discuss the dispositions. You must be wondering, what could that possibly be? Well, have you ever heard of a preposition? A postposition, but both of those are adpositions, a word which exists to modify the relationship between a verb and the associated noun or nouns in a clause. Simple concept, right? Well, adpositions have the benefit of existing. In discombobulate, we don't have that luxury. A disposition has the same effect as an adposition, except it is detected only through one of 7 consistent patterns of disfixation. The first 6 are the at disposition, which can have the effect of making the selected object carry various locative and temporal meanings. It could be at, or locative, in, or an inessive, on, or a superessive, upon, an inchoative, and so on. Next is the with disposition, which is usually used in instrumental context, but can also make the affected noun experience some causative or temporal effects. With, like an instrumental, for time durations, and or for possessing a quality in like an essive or an adjectival copula kind of way. Then there is the for disposition, which can have the effect of making the selected object carry various meanings relating to purpose and process. About, for purposes and processes, not time though. There's the via disposition, which can have the effect of making the selected object carry meanings related to causality, like because of, or by for authorship, or after even. Then there's the from disposition, which can have the effect of making the selected object carry meanings related to movement away from events and objects. Away from, unrelated to, before, ablative stuff. It's things like that. There's the near disposition, which can have the effect of making the selected object carry meanings related to proximity and similarity. Nearby, similar to, like, or even during. And then there's the seventh, but we'll get to that one in a moment. First, it's important to show how disposition is applied in a discombobulated clause. It's easier to visualize disposition positioning when looking at an interlinear gloss. Parts of a clause are bracketed within the parameters plus at and minus at, for example. Plus something represents the open bracket, the activation of the selected disposition pattern, and the minus something represents the closing bracket, the deactivation of the disposition pattern, wherever that may be required to remain grammatical. Here's an example. Let's start with the sentence with no disposition applied. No disposition here. This sentence means, I brought you to the house. Oh, it's now, in this situation, you might look at that and be like, oh, but in English, that is a preposition right there. It's to the house. But to is implied with a verb of motion like this. The verb is tindi, which means to go, carry, or to bring, depending on the transitivity of the clause. So this sentence doesn't need to contain any initial dispositions. This makes the distinction with its opposite thus much more obvious. So here is, I brought you away from the house using the from disposition. As you can see, the from rule begins after the indirect object to show that it is the direct object that is being affected by the rules of the disposition. And the rules end at the end of the clause, marked by minus from in the visuals. Your eyes do not deceive you. The primary or outermost disposition in a clause brackets from the verb to the direct object of the clause, which means it includes and affects the pronunciation of the subject, verb, and object, and all of the associated adjectives and adverbs. That is, in a non-present clause. That means that in a present tense clause, which follows the SOV word order, the direct object and verb are bracketed within the disposition procedure, but the subject doesn't need to be. This also creates variation in ditransitive clauses. As you can see in, I brought you away from the house, the sentence I just showed you, the ditransite you, right, which sits before the verb in the ditransite non-present clause, is unaffected by the from disposition procedure. The inverse applies in a present clause. However, if a disposition needs to be applied specifically to an indirect object in a ditransitive clause, a disposition can bracket exclusively around the verb and the indirect object, as in the following example, gosha o estete, which means you're punching him with your fist. In this case, the direct object is not related to the disposition. Thus, the disposition only applies to the verb and the indirect object. What are the disposition procedures? The rules of the first 6 will appear on the screen here, but each one is a disfixation, a replacement of a certain sound with a specific number of rests and or a change in the place of articulation for every affected word. For example, the from disposition replaces all affected final consonants with, that is, 2 rests, and changes the harmony to coronal, and so on and so forth. I've showed you 6 of the 7 dispositions because one of them, while not too irregular in procedure, is significant because it has a special purpose in the language. I'm talking, of course, about the dissociative disposition. It creates a partitive meaning, similar to the rik suffix in Basque. Ask me how I know. But it carries a strong burden, as this is one of the only ways to say something in the negative in discombobulate. The language has no word for no whatsoever, and thus negation can only be accomplished using the dissociative, or one other way that I'll get into later. But this one is represented in an interlinear gloss with the but disposition. For example, sa edistan a I have anything but brain damage. A classic statement by someone in denial of their discombobulation. I hear it all the time from first-time speakers, believe me. The best way to parse the dissociative disposition into English words is to say anything but X, right? Anything but brain damage in this case. This is one of the most important things to know when learning discombobulate, so be sure to write this down in your notebooks, which I'm sure is already half full of all this wisdom. Comment, I'm ready to test my dissociation skills to receive your lesson 1 exam. Disjuncts. I'm getting a little too bobulated. The next step to understand the intricacies of discombobulated speech is to understand a very frequent grammatical occurrence. Disjuncts. For those of you who don't know what a disjunct is, this is a phenomenon that appears in languages all over the world. Essentially, a disjunct is a word, phrase, or even entire sentence that fulfills the role of an adverbial phrase that describes the speaker's opinions of a primary clause or adds descriptions or context to one, while not being required for the primary clause to be grammatical. In that sense, discombobulated disjuncts function the same way. You can find disjuncts that are one word, one phrase, or an entire sentence. Very typical. What's not typical is discombobulate's disjunct disfixation rule. If a disjunct consists of one word, then you apply the first rule by deleting the first non-word initial vowel and the second consonant. This is marked on a gloss with the .dis marker, right? Most of the time, a one-word disjunct is an adverb, an adjective occupying the role of the sole constituent of an adverbial phrase, or a dispositioned noun. Here is a simple example of an adverb in the disjunct. Which means, honestly, I wish I had been concussed twice. Just as often, you'll see a multi-constituent disjunct at the beginning or end of a sentence. For this, we use the second disjunct rule, which entails removing word boundaries for all constituents, deleting the first non-word initial vowel, and replacing the final consonant with, that is, 3 rests. That's right, the word boundaries now are gone. Well, they normally already are, but now even more so, they are gone. That means the determining place of articulation for the word in the disjunct phrase determines the place of articulation for everything, except for where a word is divided by rests, of course. In a gloss, the boundaries of a multi-constituent disjunct are shown in the same sort of brackets as the dispositions. Thus, the plus or minus disj, dist, right? For example, Atelaz et nererati orukong nesi le which of course means, my opinion, Moriarty is the master of head trauma. Here, the disjunct consists of a noun phrase, my opinion, and as such it follows the second pattern. And here's one containing a full sentence in the disjunct. Nanil eneret e te se I which means, had it been me in this situation, I would have offered 3 concussions. Now, if you're looking at the screen and not just listening to this, Connor, I assume at least one of you are Connor. Maybe seeing some things in these glosses that don't make any sense whatsoever. Don't feel discouraged. You still have much to learn. I think you're finally ready to dig into some of the intricacies of dissyntax. Discombobulated syntax. Or, wait, syntax means arranging things next to each other, and discombobulate doesn't exactly do that half of the time. So should I say, I don't know, diatax or distax? Yeah, whatever it be. We talked earlier about the word order and how it's vital to understanding the tense of the clause. SOV for present, VSO for non-present. This is true nearly universally. You may think this, in combination with the 3 parameters of verb conjugation, leaves the language rigid and limited in its capacity to express different levels of agency and voice and other constructs. Well, you'd be wrong. There are other ways to modify these things, all of which involve doing things to the nouns. First, we should take a moment to learn some pronouns. 12 pages into this video script. It's not a good sign. Kill me. As you can see, there are pronouns for the first, second, and third person, which have highly irregular variations between their absolute and construct state forms. You'll notice there's also a special class which exists only for pronouns, those being the ditransite pronouns. These are effectively in the construct state as well, but they can only appear in the indirect object role in a clause. A pronoun constituent of an indirect object in the construct state will simply be a construct state pronoun. The location in the clause will convey the information well enough in most cases. Most of them. You'll notice that there is no distinction of number in the average pronoun, even though typical nouns can be found in singular, pockal, and plural forms. This is because most of the time, discombobulate speech takes place between individual combatants. However, if the number needs to be specified, one of several possible demonstratives can be used. A series of absolute construct and ditransite demonstratives exist in both the proximate and distal for singular, pockal, and plural number. These can be used on any nouns to provide emphasis and deictic reference. On their own, they can appear followed by the set particle for more convenient conversation. As for pronouns, they can precede any pronouns where the number needs to be specified, while se means I and me, together with the absolute pockal ngo, for example, ngo se, pockal and proximate, I, me, right? This can mean we, us, for any group of, say, 2 or 3 individuals. So, what does all this have to do with syntax? Well, the choice of pronouns, along with an irregular use of the construct state, can determine a lot about the syntax of a sentence. This all begins with the final set of pronouns that you should know, those being the dropped pronouns. This does not mean that Discombobulate is a pro-drop language. Dropping the pronoun in that sense destroys the grammaticality of the whole sentence. What I'm referring to is a specific class of pronouns called the dropped pronouns, and those are the following. For I and me, o for you, and for he, she, it, they, etc. You can see why we professionals still opt to call these dropped, as they're mostly, if not all, silent, and they're the key to altering the voice in a sentence where the identities of the constituents are already established. For example, seisha hago, I throw it. This is a very simple sentence. The simple use of the typical absolute state pronouns. In the non-present, it would look like this. Hoggle, seisha, which is I threw it or I will throw it, but only if there's 100% certainty. Since this is an action that could easily not happen, it's much more practical to use irrealis for a future action that is more of a choice than an inevitability. So that one right there is most likely past. Then we have seisha, which is I will throw it, or the past subjunctive were I to throw it, but that past subjunctive context would likely be put into a disjunct and thus look much different from this. For full sureness, using the auxiliary verb telent can help establish the future tense. For example, I will throw it. That first I is the present realis singularly transitive conjugation of telent. Course, obviously. To emphasize one's sureness about a future plan, an auxiliary verb is used along with a non-finite form of the main verb, specifically telent, or will. All that being said, these examples have been the simplest forms utilizing pronouns. Let's move back to the present tense, because things get worse very quickly. First, this example. Sese hagel. With the word boundary between the subject and the object removed, this sentence becomes, I have thrown it. A clause which is already perfective is now perfect. In this cursed and unfortunately very common scenario, sh, the third person pronoun, blends in with the place of articulation of se, the first person pronoun, making them look and sound exactly the same. This is just something a speaker has to memorize. Now, look at this. Hoggle. This form here incorporates the pronoun in its dropped form. Dropping a subject pronoun in a present tense clause has the result of removing the agency from the subject. So thus the sentence becomes, I am thrown by it. Additionally, se hago drops the object pronoun in a present tense clause and has the result of promoting the object to an equal level of agency, creating a sort of middle voice. I throw it and it throws me. Even worse, there's hago, where both pronouns are dropped, the subject and the object pronoun. And this has the result of removing agency from both the subject and the object, leading to a sense that would sort of come out in English as, there has been a throwing involving me and it. Since there's no dropping of typical nouns, and only the pronouns, a specific set of rules that follow a similar but not equal pattern must emerge. This could be very confusing for a novice, so be sure to take note of this before your next concussion. I wanted to say, a person breaks a window. Perfective, realis, transitive. You'd have this is the simple perfective present tense sentence. A person breaks a window. Then we follow a similar pattern to what we saw before. Removing those word boundaries right there between the subject and the object creates a perfect aspect. A person has broken a window. Here's where things get really confusing, if you're not already there yet. By declining the subject as if it were a construct noun, the subject loses its agency. A person has been broken by a window. Even though the subject has been declined as a construct noun, in the context of the whole sentence, it is known by the speaker that it is simply in this passive position, simply because of the fact that the verb is conjugated with a valency of 1 that determines everything that you need. And if you think about it, it's like saying the person's window is broken. Like, the person related to the window in this context has broken into a million pieces. It may seem disjointed and unintuitive from an English speaker's perspective, but it works grammatically. By nature of the verb being conjugated as transitive, this pins the agency to the window, despite the person being the subject of the sentence. If the sentence was then the sentence would have been an intransitive but active, the window's person breaks, as in the person pertaining or belonging to the window breaks. I personally hate it when my window watches me break. It's really embarrassing. You've seen copulas a couple times already, but I haven't explained how they work because we needed to get to this point of understanding to really get it under our belts. Copulas can be made in 3 ways. A middle voice pattern, similarly to the examples we saw earlier, a descriptive copula to apply adjectives with a noun, and the comparative copula that equates two nouns. This video script is 11,000 words long. Nistete gist le e, which means the fist is dust and the dust is a fist. This middle voice copular verb, elesne, creates these neutral tautological clauses. Remember that the use of a construct state declension in the object position here does not create a true construct noun. It simply shares its declension pattern. That is the first way to make a copula. Here's another. The nose is bloody. Using the with disposition, this simple clause describes the noun nose as possessing a quality equal to bloody. Now, with the same strategy but a different disposition, this nose seems bloody, or the nose appears to be bloody. Using the near disposition, the nose appears to be bloody or approximates bloodiness. Here's another type. It is not. Which is, the nose is dust. The equational copula verb has the effect of combining the two nouns, which are equal in hierarchy in the clause, and altering the last letter of the first noun and the first letter of the second noun, with 2 rests in between. Orthographically, there's no spaces in this language, but in the documentation, this whole sentence can be written without a space anyway, even if we were on easy mode. And the same goes for any equational copula, where The only constituents are adjective-noun pairs. The bloody nose is red dust. Right? The main grammatical difference between a sentence like this and the elezne example is that this sentence is truly gnomic. There is no tense, aspect, or mood here at all. That's basically how the copula works. Now, it's time to talk about one of the most important grammatical constructs in the whole language, commands, which come in a few forms. Commands are created with a specific construct and clauses with optative sentiments that can have similar but less rude effects. Also, one must not forget the instructional paradigm, which may look like a command in English but is distinct in Dis-combobulate as it specifically describes steps in a process. First, tie your shoes. To create a simple command, the verb is not conjugated according to aspect or mood. Instead, all vowels are deleted to create a reconfigured verb. Of course, vowels will be present in the end result, as it needs to have its illegal clusters resolved. In this example, tezlise becomes teris. Next, which would translate something along the lines of, may you tie your shoes, or you should tie your shoes. In this case, having a sentence in the present tense but the irrealis mood can equally indicate a possibility in the short term, or it could be a nice way of telling somebody to do something. This next way to form a command, the instructional command, is the most common and the most important by far, so pay attention. Tie shoes. The verb that can be thought of as an auxiliary verb, meaning to complete a task, which affects a direct object. If an instructional task contains only the verb itself, as so often happens, you are yielded with a situation like this. Which of course translates to
Discombobulate.
in an intransitive instructional command, the auxiliary verb that resolves naturally, and thus the lone q suffix dissolves into nothingness. The unmarked verb to discombobulate, or which of course directly translates to language learn please, turned into a command and given the R as an initial consonant, turns the whole sentence into simply We're almost done now, though I can't say the worst is behind us. Let's circle back to the form of negation we talked about several minutes ago, the dissociative disposition. Sa etistan which is I have anything but brain damage. Seems simple now, right? There's one other way to negate something, though, and that is the appropriately named dismissive disfix. Which means I have not brain damage. This is an example of a one-constituent dismissive disfix. It dismisses the concept of having brain damage in this case. The dismissive disfix rule for a one-word dismissal involves deleting the first non-word initial consonant and replacing it with two rests. Also, if the final sound is a vowel, follow it with. If two or more constituents need to be dismissed, then you must remove word boundaries, then between every consonant or vowel cluster add and delete the first non-word initial consonant, replacing it with, for example, shai at netete, meaning they have not good fists. This is an example of a multi-constituent dismissive disfix. It dismisses the concept of having good fists. Fun little side note, the dismissive disfix is also how the concept of zero is expressed in mathematics. If you noticed earlier during our numbers discussion, there was a distinct lack of zero, and that's why. It's also worth mentioning that there are no true questions in Discombobulate. If you want clarification about something, common phrases include, I have anything but understanding, or I may need more information. Lastly, before we move on to a few more mind blowers, with everything you've learned so far, you might be wondering, what is the most silent possible sentence in Discombobulate? Well, it should come as no surprise that it is, which of course means there has been a helping involving me and it for it. Oh wait, actually, it could be a little bit longer than that. Disconnection. I haven't been totally honest with you all today. It may be time for the nguz over party. And I accept that because I lied to you all. I'm so sorry. But every single sentence I've shown you in this entire video so far has been ungrammatical, at least semantically. Technically, they've been mostly passable, but if you want to truly be a nesit, or a fluent speaker, or a master anurist, of course, there's something vitally important that you absolutely must know how to do, and that is disconnection. In semantics, the term focus can be used to describe new information that relates to pre-established content. A subcategory of focus that you might already be familiar with is contrastive focus. In English, focus is generally realized by stress. For example, stressing Rome in the sentence, Peter went to Rome, and not somewhere else specifically, right? The inner workings of how exactly our brains process focus are still subject to debate, but one theory states that comprehending a sentence is a two-step process. When we encounter a sentence such as Peter went to Rome, we first construct a more generalized structure, that being Peter went to X, with any focused elements replaced by variables, if you will. This has the effect of restricting the set of plausible possible worlds to any such worlds in which the state of affairs Peter went to X obtains, where X is some element in the domain of discourse. In simpler terms, this is the set of possible worlds in which Peter went somewhere rather than, for example, just staying at home. Finally, the actual value of the variable, that being the focused element, restricts this already restricted set of worlds to any such worlds in which X equals Rome. Semanticists argue that this two-step process is simpler than trying to understand the entire sentence in one go, if you will. Discombobulate, however, is no such language. Specifically, the expression of focus is handled completely differently. Instead of emphasizing focused elements, discombobulate de-emphasizes unfocused elements. This procedure is known as disconnection. This means that a simple translation of a sentence such as Peter went to Rome to discombobulate is really Peter went to Rome, with all complements of the verb perceived as focused. Such a sentence, of course, is really only suited as, for example, the answer to the question, who went where? Meaning that the sentences presented so far have not exactly been ungrammatical per se, but rather just oddly specific. Of course, owing to the fact that this is effectively the exact opposite of how humans naturally think, it should come as no surprise that disconnection constitutes a speech pattern readily used by only the more thoroughly discombobulated. The grammatical realization of disconnection employs quite literally disconnecting the element in question from the rest of the sentence, using both prosody in the form of stress and by inserting a 16th rest before and after each disconnected constituent. For instance, consider this sentence. The meaning of this sentence is, I throw it. While this fully connected, that is, not disconnected, sentence is grammatical, it's only suitable as a possible answer to a question such as, who throws what? Now, in this sentence here, the pronoun se has been disconnected from the rest of the sentence to form se. This both makes the sentence sound completely different and changes its meaning to I throw it, or it is it that I throw. This sentence is a possible answer to the question, you throw what? Alternatively, we can disconnect sh instead to form I throw it. I think you get the point by now. Once all complements of the main verb have been disconnected, the verb itself becomes, or rather remains, emphasized. That is, by combining the two previous sentences, we get I throw it, or throwing is what I do to it. This is probably not what you want. Obviously, to de-emphasize both the verb and all of its complements, we disconnect only the verb, right? Only now we have arrived at a sentence that is admissible as a standalone utterance, without the context of being an answer to a question. Of course, most sentences contain more things than just verbs and simple complements, such as adverbials, which aren't affected by disconnecting the verb. For example, this sentence here means, I throw it twice. To avoid this, we must disconnect any adverbials as well, which finally yields this, which is, I throw it twice. With both the verb and the adverbial disconnected, at last, true disconnection is achieved. There's a few more details to disconnection, such as the fact that constructions that employ verbs with joined nouns, for example, some of the copuli, are disconnected as a whole, and the fact that construct state nouns are viewed as already disconnected and thus never undergo disconnection. But I think now we've talked about this enough. For now, that is. We'll get back to this later. This does yield us the true longest silent sentence in Dis-combobulate, though. By disconnecting the subject and the object, and thus emphasizing the verb, we get which means helping it occurred involving me and it. Though I guess you could apply the dissociative disfix to this, and it literally changes nothing. So it could also be anything but helping it occurred involving me and it. I'm sure that'll come in handy to you someday. Dissection. Now that you know how to disfix, disposition, dissociate, dismiss, and even disconnect, it's time to learn what is undisputably the most disgusting aspect of the entire grammar of the language of the discombobulated. This is the last major thing you need to learn before you're ready for your final exam. Oh boy, and it's something. I'm going to attempt to teach you, my humble pupils, how to dissect. In Discombobulate, in order to insert a subordinate clause into a sentence beneath a primary clause, a special procedure known as dissection is required. Dissection splits up the components of a subordinate clause amongst the sentence in a regular manner. The first requirement to create a subordinate clause is for the dominant clause in the hierarchy to have a valency of at least 1, and for the verb of the subordinate clause to be placed in the direct object position of the dominant clause. Let's try to create the following sentence. I wish you had been concussed twice. Step 1. Identify the dominant or primary clause. In this case is se, then the object, right? I wish for whatever the object is. Within that space marked for object will go the verb. Within the space marked for object will go the verb of the subordinate clause. But the positions of the other words from the subordinate clause must be placed a bit more, dare I say, surgically. Step 2. Identify the subordinate clause. In this case, the subordinate clause would be zin which is you had been concussed twice. Simple enough. One realis sentence, another irrealis. Time to merge them. Start with just the verb. Step 3. Insert the verb phrase from the subordinate clause in the object position of the dominant clause, getting us the incorrect sentence, sezin This is not complete. It's time to attempt our first dissection. In this case, it's a simple one, but step 4. Insert the nouns from the subordinate clause throughout the new full sentence according to the tense and valence of the primary and subordinate clause. In this case, the primary clause is present and has a valency of 1, and the subordinate clause is non-present and has a valency of 1. Thus, the end result is as follows. Sezin I wish you had been concussed twice. This may look intuitive and simple, but it's actually just one type of end result on a matrix of dissection procedures. In fact, it's easier to visualize these by highlighting individual clauses with colors going forward. In this example, the whole subordinate clause just happens to be cozily sandwiched between the constituents of the primary clause. Let's get more advanced though. The following graphic can be used to determine the positions of the parts of the subordinate clause according to tense and valency. where V represents the position in the sentence where the main verb of the subordinate clause has been inserted, and S, O, and I are given plus values for how many spaces to the right they move, or minus values for how many spaces to the left they move. If there is not enough lexical units in the sentence to move parts of the subordinate clause to the proper number of spaces left or right, they move as far left or right as they can. Another example, let's look at a similar sentence, except the primary clause has a valency of 2 instead of 1. Sezin I wish for you that you had been concussed twice. Now, you might understand why this procedure is called dissection. If not, you will. Look at that sentence, and now observe the general pattern visualized. Here's another one, with some more words for extra spliced dissection. Which of course means, I told them for you that the man punched him in the jaw. You can even do this with nested subordination, as in 3 clauses dissected together. In this case, the elements of the tertiary clause stick to its secondary clause neighbors when being inserted into the primary clause to create the correct sentence. With that, take these 3 sentences for example. Se, object, which is, I can confidently confirm. Then we have talsha, object, which means his capacity has been neutralized. And the third, ne asha tartartse, which is, he may spit at the back of my head. After doing 2 absolutely brutal dissections, you get an end result like this. Which is, I can confidently confirm that his capacity to spit at the back of my head has been neutralized. Okay, now you know how to dissect. But the astute amongst you may have noticed that all of these dissection examples seemingly don't use disconnection. Well, remember how I said at the end of the disconnection section that we'll get back to this later? Well, later is now, because in clauses that employ dissection, disconnection is realized by movement in addition to the insertion of rests. That is, verbs and nouns are disconnected from the clause they belong to by moving them to the end of the sentence. The particles u and a serve as proforms for such disconnected verbs and nouns respectively, and assume the original position of any disconnected elements. For instance, this simple sentence from earlier is not actually, I wish you had been concussed twice, but rather, I wish you had been concussed twice. Let's first look at the nested clause. That is the you had been concussed twice. As discussed earlier, disconnecting the object leaves the verb emphasized. That is, I wish you had been concussed twice. There are 2 things to note here. First, we can observe the disconnective nominal proform, highlighted here in yellow, being used to excise the noun from its clause. The noun itself, highlighted as well, is moved to the end of the sentence. Regular disconnection also applies. Regular disconnection also applies, which is why we have all here and not all. A difference that I'm sure you all noticed immediately. Secondly, it's important to note that the subject of the matrix clause, I, is still emphasized since we haven't disconnected it yet. We're only working on the nested clause right now. We'll get to it. Now, since we don't actually want to emphasize the verb, we actually need to disconnect it instead. This looks similar to the previous sentence, but note that we're now using u instead of a. Of course, this still leaves the twice emphasized. So to get rid of that, we disconnect it as well. Twice is neither a noun nor a verb, so it stays where it is, and we only insert the rests around it. Now that the nested clause has been fully disconnected, we can move to the matrix clause. First, if we wanted to only disconnect the object to form, I wish you had been concussed twice, we would do it like this. Pay special attention to the order of the disconnected nouns and verbs at the end of the sentence, because these are sorted top down, left to right. That is, if we have a sentence that consists of a nested clause of the form A, B, C as such, that is, that A contains B which contains C, then the order of any elements disconnected from within those clauses when moved to the end of the sentence will be A, B, C, where the lowercase a, b, c are elements disconnected from the uppercase A, B, and C, respectively. In this case, we only have one nested clause, so its disconnected elements are placed before that of the matrix clause. Now finally, to truly disconnect everything, we disconnect the verb of the matrix clause instead of the pronoun to end up, and once again, true disconnection is achieved. Note again that the first u here corresponds to the second verb at the end of the sentence, and the second to the first. In other words, the verb of the matrix clause has effectively ended up inside of the subordinate clause. Armed with this knowledge, you can now finally say that you've truly mastered both dissection and disconnection. You are now qualified to behold the triply dissected sentence from before in its true disconnected form. I'm sorry if my didactics have been distracting, but dissection is just so displeasing that I can't help but emotionally distance myself from this disjointed mess. We're almost done, I promise. Order of operations. This is the very last thing I'll be teaching you today, and it is really one of the first things a new learner should memorize. There are just so many sequences of disfixation procedures in this language that it could be easy to get lost. Disfixing one linguistic property onto a word before another when it should have been the other way around can yield an entirely different result, probably an ungrammatical one. That's why I'd like to display to you all my final lesson, the order of operations. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. More like, yeah, I'm not doing that for this. For verbs, first is the aspect, perfective, imperfective, or habitual. Then the irrealis or realis. Then the intransitive, transitive, or ditransitive. Then interword relations, such as the QR conversion. Then nested dispositions. Sixth, outermost dispositions. And finally, disconnect, if applicable. For nouns, first there are the basic inflections, such as singular, pocal, plural, and absolute or construct. Second comes the relations with other elements of a compound noun. Third, there are the interword relations, such as the Q and R conversion. Fourth are the nested dispositions. Fifth, the outermost disposition. And then sixth, disconnect, if applicable. For adjectives, a little better. First, the relations with other elements of a compound noun or compound adjective. Second, the nested dispositions. Third, the outermost dispositions. And fourth, disconnect, if applicable. For adverbs, first comes the nested dispositions. Second comes the outermost dispositions. And finally, disconnect, if applicable. For disjuncts, first, follow all internal rules for any constituent nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, etc. Second, remove all word boundaries between constituents. And third, follow the disjunct disfixing procedure. Oh, God. And for dissection, first, dissect until grammatically correct. And second, disconnect, if applicable. Now, you may be asking, how is a person who just received severe brain trauma supposed to go through this procedure accurately and precisely? Well, in a properly concussed state, one reaches a point of temporal stasis in which the proper end result can be calculated for every word without fail. Additionally, someone who is fully cogent can use this language as a means of psychological warfare. Try speaking to someone in Dis-combobulate. Look at their reaction. If the victim's face contorts and odd emotional results occur, you'll know you've already won. With that, I think you're ready. What I'm about to show you is a particularly famous exchange between professional discombobulator and frequent concussion patient, Sherlock Holmes, engaged in a healthy conversation with another highly capable fluent speaker, all in its original intended language. Footage will be slowed down and distorted to provide a more realistic, immersive experience, and totally not to try and avoid copyright detection. Na go shenyan go ja go kung te o I go se o hog Lise se nader te ta is nerarit in erat tal jiznil ayradish shot etir listis o teneri edetare yekint ne I nyaje sistal dinsir kongul inzavit eter is tal I an nes şıçıcısı lida ağolak etit ikinci kakakak örgün ho ideal neler irisnenal diret etçeriz nenyerit etçeri gahakak etçeriz and la el nenyis lasas tile rariren gokohan ze I tel risnelair tile tini del arnje nereli la ayari ranch in tete assegni I tinted otisre kopak mose and just Angel Elders in el al talche u se tartar se u Ireland go sir ne Sani Sazzareratina ennesi dedene That's probably a polite way to end the conversation. Now that you have everything you need, I'd like to thank all of our deep state institutional PSYOP backers from patreon.com/nga and YouTube memberships, including the new patrons that have joined since the last video. Millie, probably not a criminal, B ___________, BE plays MCE, Ethan Hant, and Darthinian. You are doing great work for our psychological warfare initiative, and I'll send you the latest word from the CIA at the shortest convenience. What I meant to say was, thank you all for helping me survive out here in the Basque Country while I'm on an extremely limited budget. Not only does Patreon pay for the Minecraft server and the website, but it has also actually paid for a few meals, right? Well, I've been like genuinely low on cash. I'm coming back to Arizona soon. Patrons also get access to the secret Discord chat and the Minecraft server, and get early looks at my artwork, including my webcomic Jajawa Doror, which is on chapter 3 now. Also, when I have a green screen again, you'll get to provide memes for that too. I appreciate you all very deeply. Lots of more stuff to come, cursed and otherwise. You'll be War of the Pearled in the near future if all goes according to plan. And I'll be back in the beautiful, hot land of Arizona very soon, where I will be attempting to go fully independent with my arbor business and I guess my YouTube work too, if all goes according to plan. Who knows though? The economy sucks. Anyway, with that, is out. Go concuss somebody you love. As always, Seiko an intention Goodbye. Mwah. Elga! Elga! Sani!
Quite indubitably. Your skills of deduction are improving as we speak. God, reality is good. Why don't you go ahead and hit that there subscribe button? It don't hurt you none. Go ahead. Hit that subscribe button. This was an 11,000 word video script that Eternal and I have been working on for approximately 5 months. Please, if you like this content, please